Okay, welcome to the only video for chapter 6. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a good place to break this video up in the middle, so I'm going to go through the entire chapter in one shot, and hopefully you'll watch this video more than once because there's a lot of content here. Okay, right off the get-go, there are 3 different acronyms you're going to have to find yourself familiar with immediately. LQP, LPG, and NEP. Just so you don't get confused, NEP, the main topic in this chapter, is the new economic policy of 1991. Now, what was that new economic policy? That new economic policy consisted of LPG, which refers to liberalization, privatization, and globalization. These 3 were replacing the old policies of licensing, quotas, and permits. If you remember back to our previous chapters, we talked about India's 5-year plans. And actually, there were a number of plans. Some of them were 5 years, some of them were 1 year. But each of those plans focused around licensing, quotas, and permits in order to be able to generate GDP growth. However, in 1991, the Indian government took a completely different stance for a wide variety of reasons, which we'll get into later. And licensing was then replaced by liberalization. Quotas were replaced by privatization. And permits were replaced by globalization. So we're going to talk about the need for the reform before we get into anything else. So the first thing, why did we need the reform? Well, there were 6 significant reasons. Firstly, there was a mounting fiscal deficit. Secondly, there was an adverse balance of payments. Next, the Gulf crisis was going on at that time, followed by a fall in foreign exchange reserves. Next, we had inflation or a rise in prices. And finally, there was a poor performance in the public sector undertakings that the government was engaged in. Okay, so let's take a look first at the mounting fiscal deficit in more detail. The fiscal deficit. Actually, before we talk about that, what is the difference between the deficit and the debt? The easy way for you to rectify these 2 things in your mind is the deficit is the 1-year difference between spendings and savings for the government. The debt is the gross amount of deficits across the history of a country. For instance, if the government lost 100 yen in year 1, 100 yen in year 2, and 100 yen in year 3, if there were no borrowing costs, their debt would be 300 yen. But their deficit for that final year, in fact for every year, would only be 100 yen. Okay, let's get back to our story. So the mounting fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit in India rose from 5.4% in 1981 all the way up to 8.4% by 1990. At the same time, because this deficit was rising, it had an impact on the debt. And the interest payments on the debt rose from 10% in 1981 to an astounding 36.4% by 1991 as measured against GDP. Another significant area of distress for India was the adverse balance of payments. In 1981, the total value of the adverse balance of payments, which is the difference between transactions in goods, services, and assets purchased from abroad against those sold abroad, was approximately 2,200 crore rupees. However, within 10 years, that skyrocketed to an astounding 17,000 crore rupees. What does that mean? Well, that means that the number of foreign loans also rapidly increased because individuals had to borrow money from abroad to be able to finance purchases of foreign goods and services. And that amount, which was 12% in 1980, jumped to 23% within 10 years. And that also meant that servicing on that debt, which was 15% in 1980, jumped also to 30% by 1990. Another reason the Indian government faced dire circumstances in 1991 was because of the Gulf crisis. Now, you might not understand this very well because India is not located in the Gulf. So what does that mean? Well, when the American government and the Iraqi government engaged in military conflict, it sent oil prices around the world skyrocketing. And because India was heavily dependent on oil, the prices of its imports rapidly rose. This really hurt India's ability to be able to afford those resources as their prices were skyrocketing. And this was not limited to India. This was happening all around the world. Next, their foreign exchange reserves fell drastically. The Indian government was in such a bind at one point that they were forced to mortgage their existing gold reserves with the World Bank in order to discharge their debt obligation. That means that they had not enough money to be able to pay their debt, and they said to the bank, look, we have assets of gold. We're willing to mortgage against our gold in order to be able to pay off these debts. It's a very, very drastic thing to do and an absolute last resort for any country. Next, prices in the market, probably almost directly as a result of the Gulf crisis, began skyrocketing, and the inflation rate at one point reached 16.7%. You can imagine how that would adversely affect people who are heavily dependent on cash. Next, the poor performance of the PSUs. Well, the public sector enterprises are typically wasteful regions, as we discussed earlier in Chapter 1 and 2. So there were only 5 enterprises in India in 1951 that were public sector. However, by 1991, the total number was in excess of 240. The wasteful spending by those government firms and their mismanagement and looting of funds and leakages of government money meant that the Indian government was in a very precarious position because it was bleeding money in a wide variety of areas. In order to escape all of these debts, the government actually borrowed $7 billion from the IMF in order to survive. And in order to do so, the IMF had some conditions. And those conditions were, if you want our money, you have to engage in NEP, which was the new economic policy, which meant focusing on liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So let's take a look at what that meant. Liberalization first. Okay, so let's talk about liberalization. What is liberalization? Well, liberalization simply means the freedom from government control. The Indian government wanted to control every type of business activity within the economy to ensure that a certain level of social standard was met, because they were very, very worried about things happening with monopolistic power and economic control being in the hands of too few. So they set up a wide variety of rules and ensured that there would be no way that anybody could manipulate the poor and weak of India. However, by doing so, they restricted growth and a lot of unintended consequences occurred. Now, within the liberalization process, there are 4 key subject areas to discuss: the industrial sector reforms, financial sector reforms, fiscal sector reforms, and the external sector reforms. The industrial sector reforms themselves have a number of subpoints. The first one being the abolition of the industrial licensing. Well, what does that mean? Well, prior to 1991, you needed some sort of government license to engage in any sort of business. Well, abolition means that's no longer true. So firms and individuals were able to freely engage in establishing businesses and engaging in economic activity without government approval. Industrial licensing only remains in the 5 following areas today: liquor, cigarettes, defense equipment, industrial explosives, and dangerous chemicals. All other industries are free from licensing. Next, let's talk about the contraction of the public sector. Well, there were government firms involved in 17 different industries at around 1990. But by 2010, that had dropped to 8, and as of present, they're only involved in 2 sectors: atomic energy and railways. And since government firms are very, very cost ineffective and waste money, it's a very, very good thing. Next, the dereservation of production areas. Many production areas were reserved for small-scale industries, but small-scale industries tend not to earn a lot of profit. So by making these areas now open to big business or to any other types of businesses or individuals who want to enter and engage in profitable ventures, this could also spur economic growth. The expansion of production capacity. Previously, the government limited the amount of expansion that could occur by saying that the amount to be produced by any given firm was limited. But now, because of liberalization, the amounts of production are unlimited and are only controlled by market forces. And finally, within the industrial sector reforms, we have the freedom to import capital goods. Prior to this new agreement of 1991, the Indian government forced firms to engage in international agreements whenever they imported technology from foreign firms or foreign countries. As a result of that, you can imagine obtaining permits and permissions led to lots of leakages and bribery, which was inefficient and slow and ineffective. However, with this now out of the way, India's technological base has rapidly expanded since 1991. You can clearly see how this benefited the economy. Secondly, let's talk about the financial sector reforms. Well, the key point here is liberalization meant that the Reserve Bank of India was to change its role from being a regulator of the market to being a facilitator, which simply means they're no longer designed to operate as the police of the economy, but rather as a helper to ensure that economic activity can occur. As a result of this, the number of foreign investment banks and even domestic banks have rapidly increased, and there's been lots of growth in this industry in India. Next, fiscal reforms. Fiscal reforms simply refers to government tax revenue collection and then the spending of those tax revenues on infrastructural programs and facilities. So the Indian government was trying to make sure that people paid taxes, and what they did was they implemented taxes in a wide variety of areas, and the tax implementation rules were very complex and the rates were often very high, especially in some specific areas. So as we learned in class through the Laffer curve, when taxes pass a certain threshold, individuals are incentivized to engage in black market activity, and when they do, government tax holdings actually decrease. So liberalization meant a simplification of the tax programs and policies to ensure that the tax levels were relatively moderate and simple to follow. And once they did that, the Indian government actually realized a real increase in tax revenues. And finally, external sector reforms were devaluating the Indian rupee. Now you might be wondering, what is this? Well, the exchange reforms in 1991 allowed the rupee to be cheaper. What does that mean? That means if they're cheaper against the American dollar, Americans can now buy more Indian goods with their American money because their American money goes further. And a result of that is Indian investment, or rather, investment into India from America will rapidly increase, which is actually what happened. And acquisition of Indian goods will also increase because Indian goods are relatively cheaper. Also, in order to further expedite this growth, the Indian government moved away from their ideal of protecting the domestic industry to a global trade ideal, which meant allowing trade across all sorts of international borders with limited quota and tariff protection for their domestic industry. Next, let's move on to privatization. In privatization, the government simply began reducing its operations in the public sector. In the beginning, as you remember in 1951, the Indian government wanted the people of India to move away from the agricultural sector and into the industrial sector. So as a result, they set up their 5-year plans with the hope of moving into more industrialized production. And in order to ensure that it was fair, they wanted to maintain government control over those sectors. However, there were many troubles with this. And in 1991, due to leakages, inefficiency, corruption, a whole bunch of issues, they decided to no longer, or actually they were forced by the IMF, to no longer be allowed to operate in such a way so that the government would control these industries or these sectors. And the market forces were allowed to operate freely. As a result of this, economic activity rapidly increased and the impact on GDP was significant. Finally, let's take a look at globalization. What do we have here? Globalization means integrating the economy of a country with those of economies around the world. More simply said, we want to be able to compete with foreign industries and foreign firms and foreign nations on an equal basis following the same rule structure. This will allow for more trade across international borders. And this is one of the significant reforms that happened after the NEP of 1991. Now, globalization had 5 distinct points which you need to remember. The first is that there was an increase in equity limit of foreign investment. Prior to the new economic policy of 1991, foreign investment was limited to only 40% of Indian firm ownership. However, as a result of this new globalization policy, foreign firms are allowed to engage in up to 100% of ownership. Next, partial convertibility allows for the acquisition of foreign currency at a fixed rate if they are being used for the acquisition of import and export goods, the payment of interest or dividends on investment, and remittances to meet family expenses. Next, the long-term trade policy. Well, the long-term trade policy means that economic reforms were enlisted for a period of more than 5 years, at least 5 years. So if I'm trading with India, I know that the rules there will not change for this 5-year process, which means for the next 5 years, my investment there would be stable and I could trust investing in India. And as a result, more foreign firms have been willing to engage in activity in India. The reduction of tariffs, as mentioned earlier, foreign goods are not prevented from entering the market with excessive taxes. And finally, the withdrawal of quantitative restrictions. Prior to this agreement, the Indian government set quantity restrictions on imports into India. However, these have all been abandoned. So, where does this leave us? How do we think the new economic policy of 1991 has changed India? Has India improved? Has India gone in a backwards direction? Well, there are 9 distinct merits that I think you can easily understand. First, the economy has become far more vibrant. Secondly, industrial production has rapidly increased. Next, the fiscal deficit has come under control. Following that, inflation has also been brought under control. Next, consumer sovereignty. This means consumers now have the ability to purchase a wide variety of goods in a wide variety of industries from a wide variety of suppliers. This means the individual is free to buy what they want, where they want, when they want. Next, there's been a substantial increase in foreign exchange reserves, followed by a flow of private foreign investment, which means foreigners are now investing in India. And as a result of all of the ones that I've just mentioned, India's image as an emerging economic power rapidly started to improve, and it's been considered one of the hubs for textiles and IT, and I think all of you should know that. And finally, the Indian market went away from a monopolistic market into a competitive market, which meant prices went down, which means that the individual consumer has benefited greatly as prices have become cheaper and services have improved. However, with that said, you should realize there are also 6 distinct demerits. They are as follows. 1. Agriculture has been neglected. 2. Populations have merged on urban centers throughout the country. Next, economic colonialism, which is what India was afraid of in 1951 when the British left. They didn't want power to be in the hands of too few. But some might argue it's not to the extent that it was under British rule. Next, the spread of consumerism, the mentality of buy goods as cheaply as possible and save as much money as you can, drives production costs down, which means labor costs will also suffer. Next, lopsided growth. Well, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and the middle class erosion occurs. India really didn't have much of a middle class to begin with, and I think this is kind of strange because the middle class in India has begun or has emerged in the recent decades. So although there is some truth in poor getting poorer, I think the vast majority have improved their quality of life. Next, the lopsided growth process. Some industries grew rapidly. Some industries didn't grow at all. But that's the nature of the market. Some goods will survive, some industries will succeed, and some will fall by the wayside. The goal is efficiency, not equality. And unfortunately, I think the textbook here misunderstands equality and efficiency as being the same. They're not the same. And lastly, cultural erosion. Well, since we have people striving for lower cost goods and individuals engaged in commercialism and trying to profit as much as they can, there's an emergence of an elite class or the rich, while at the same time there's a growth in the people who are poor or unfortunate at the bottom of the society. And some argue that this is unfortunately the beginning of the destruction of the social norms in India because we have two groups. However, I see it differently. I think if you compare or you want to say this is true, you need to look at the average income per person in India prior to NEP and post NEP, and then argue whether or not the average person's life quality has improved or declined. My supposition, without knowing any data and without looking at the data because there is no data in the book, is that although there is some truth to the fact that cultural erosion may occur as some people are suffering, the vast majority have likely benefited. So even though the textbook only mentions 6 demerits and 9 merits, they try to pull at your heartstrings to suggest that the demerits are very, very important. And they may be important, but I think they're a natural result of focusing on economic efficiency and not demerits of this system per se. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this rather lengthy chapter. I would recommend you watch this video at least 2 or 3 times before our tests.